Hey. Hey gang, hope you can see me. So great job with the clicker activity, by the way. That was great. I'm glad that worked out. Often these things don't, and they consume a lot of our time when that happens. So I thank you all very much from the bottom of my heart. Okay, that's an exaggeration. We're going to talk about exaggerations, by the way, a little bit later. So if you don't know what that means, exaggeration, hang on to your hats and we'll march right into it. So we've been talking a lot about adjectives and adverbs. We covered a lot. I don't need to cover them again, the ones we listed, I don't think. Or we can do that after class, up to you. But I want to get into something a little more complicated. So let's talk about sentences and phrases a bit more, shall we? That's a rhetorical question, isn't it? What's a rhetorical question? That is kind of related to what we're getting into right now. So what's a rhetorical question? Okay, yeah, that's a good definition. So it's a question that I already have an answer to, and I actually don't intend to answer. I don't need to because I already know the answer, right? And the answer is yes, usually. Isn't that right? Well, no, not exactly. It could be no. But anyway, the answer should be obvious in the case of a rhetorical question. It's just there to the question is to make a point. It's not to ask. It's not to get an answer to you because I don't know the answer. I do know the answer. But anyway, instead of going on about that all afternoon, let's talk about, let's get into metaphor. That's what I really want to discuss is metaphor. It's kind of, shares a related property. What is metaphor? Can you define it for me? Metaphor. Okay, I think we're getting there. It's not necessarily, no, it doesn't have to be a question. It doesn't even have to be a sentence, or it doesn't have to be even a part of a sentence, exactly. It's really a feature of what you're saying, what you're writing, what you're speaking. Okay, yes. So a very simple definition is something in language that stands in for something else. So basically, I am describing something by talking about something else in its place. Do you know what I mean? I'm sure you have lots of metaphor in your own language that you've known from your childhood. Isn't that right? So, why do we use metaphor? Why is it useful? Yeah, okay. So comparing things. Sometimes it's just easier to talk about things by talking about something else. Isn't that right? Some things are just too complicated, and we need to describe something else in order to make sense of it sometimes. I think that's definitely true. Plus, as people, our minds are good at comparing, and we do it often without thinking about it. We just compare things. We relate things to one another that seem the same. Maybe they're not exactly the same. Maybe they're not related to each other. But it's just easier for us as people to talk that way, I think. Metaphor. So, to relate this to what we've been talking about for a while now, which is our story, the snow goose. Paul Gallico, doesn't he use metaphor to describe some of the themes, some of the ideas, the main ideas and components, characters in the story? Like the snow goose, for example. What does the white bird stand in for? Does the snow goose itself, from the title, stand in for any ideas, any main ideas, or people, places in the story? Is the snow goose a metaphor? What could it be a metaphor for? Friendship, raider, maybe it could be it kind of seems to stand in for Fritha, her a lot of the times when she's not around, kind of. But friendship, I think. How about what else? What else is the story about? We talked about this. So heroism, maybe. It's not always clear what a metaphor is supposed to represent. Sometimes it can mean a lot of things. It can be complicated, which is what's useful about a metaphor, really, right? So, okay, so I think we've talked a lot about metaphor. And remember I used the term beating a dead horse. Remember that? I'm not exactly beating a dead horse, right? Was I? Okay, maybe that was kind of a metaphor. So I'm going to make this a little bit simpler. We've talked about metaphor. We see how complicated it can be. I think we can make it a little simpler. Who's heard of analogy? You know the term analogy? You've heard that, right? When you're talking about analogy, it's very clear. It becomes very clear that what you are speaking about is a replacement for something else. It's what you're saying. Right, it could be a sentence. It could be right there. What I'm saying right now. What I'm reading right now in a book. When we know that that sentence is actually describing something else. It's talking about one thing by describing something else. That's an analogy. So it's a metaphorical sentence in a way. Right, so yeah, so when I'm talking about analogy, I'm not talking about something different from metaphor. I'm just making it more short and compact. An analogy is a sentence like that. Or it could be just like I said, a phrase. Can you give me an example of a phrase like that? Okay, an analogy. So we see it in the story, don't we? When we see, do we see any analogies to describe the main character, Philip Rader? What's some language what are some common words that we see in phrases like that, where we're comparing something, where we want the person to know that this thing that we're talking about is referring to another thing. Okay, yeah. I'm using these words all the time, by the way. So words like, okay, yeah, we're comparing. What do we say when we're comparing? Related to, like, it's kind of like that, right? How about if it's exactly like that? Okay, we can say that, or is, are, words like that are more definite. Okay, so that's analogy, right? Remember when Raider was walking into town, what were the people thinking when they saw him? Could they maybe have been thinking of some analogies to describe him? Raider, he's like a monster, is he? Okay, well, we realize that he's not exactly a monster towards the end of the story, or really, we know that from the start, I believe. So one of the words we used to compare something is similar, right? Similar is a adjective. Similarly is an adverb. We use that word to compare something with another thing, right? In an analogy. There's a sentence that is similar. The word, it's a type of sentence. It's a type of analogy, an analogy type sentence. And it sounds similar to the word similar. A million laughs. I'm exaggerating again. Okay, the word that maybe you've not heard of this, the word simile. That you use the word simile, and I've been using it already. It's a type of analogy you use basically to compare things. That's the type of analogy that you use when you want to compare something, using words like, similar, similarly. That's very similar to blah, blah, blah. Okay, yeah. That's, yeah, you're comparing things. Maybe you're not they're not exactly standing